Welcome. Today's deep dive is brought to you by Skip Benton with Coldwell Bankers Select Real Estate. If you are looking to buy a home in Northern Nevada, then contact Skip. Okay, so you're hearing all this buzz about rising house prices and wondering, if we're headed for another crash, maybe even like a repeat of the 2008 foreclosure crisis. And it's a valid concern, especially, if you've been following those alarming headlines. But what if I told you things might not be as dire as they seem? Today, we're going deep into a report by Bill McBride. He's a housing analyst at CalculatedRisk. The report is titled, "There's Not Going to Be a Wave of Foreclosures." And it was published December 2nd, 2024. Our mission, to understand why some experts aren't hitting that panic button just yet.
It's interesting, isn't it, this disconnect,
Yeah.
between public perception, which tends to be, shaped by those attention-grabbing headlines,
Yeah.
and what the data is actually telling us.
Right, and one of the first things McBride tackles is consumer debt. It's at a record high,
Well,
which on the surface sounds like a recipe for disaster, but
But here's the catch. It's not the amount of debt that's the primary concern. It's the type of debt and who's holding it. Think back to 2008. Lending standards were practically non-existent. People were getting mortgages they couldn't afford, with very little scrutiny. Today, it's a different ballgame. Lenders are much more cautious. They're carefully examining income, credit scores, and making sure borrowers can actually handle the debt.
so it's less about the raw numbers
Mm-hmm.
and more about responsible lending practices this time around. That makes sense. But what about all those stories we hear about people being squeezed by inflation and rising costs? Shouldn't that be pushing more homeowners towards foreclosure?
It's a fair point, and that's where homeowner equity comes into play. The report has this eye-opening visual, comparing total homeowner equity to mortgage debt. And let me tell you, it's a game changer. Homeowner equity is significantly outpacing mortgage debt.
So what does that actually mean for the average homeowner?
It means they have options, a cushion to fall back on. Imagine having a financial safety net. That's what home equity provides. They can tap into that equity through a home equity line of credit, or even sell their home and walk away with a profit, even if they still owe money on their mortgage.
That's pretty reassuring, but I'm still a bit wary. Couldn't this equity be wiped out if prices drop sharply? Like, what are the limits of this safety net?
You're right to be cautious. And yes, a significant price drop could erode some of that equity. But remember, we're talking about a substantial cushion here. The report states that the average homeowner has $319,000 in equity.
Wow, that's a pretty impressive number.
It is. And even more striking, $207,000 of that equity could potentially be borrowed against, while still maintaining a healthy 20% equity cushion. That's a significant safety net. This level of equity makes it far less likely that homeowners will be forced into foreclosure. They have options that simply weren't available during the last housing crisis.
Okay, so we've got stricter lending standards and homeowners sitting on a mountain of equity. But does this really mean we're safe from a wave of foreclosures? What about those homeowners who are still struggling to make ends meet?
That's where we look at delinquency rates. The report highlights incredibly low delinquency rates right now, and that raises the question, why are so few homeowners actually falling behind on their payments?
We are in a period of relatively low unemployment, right? That's got to be a factor. People who have jobs can generally keep up with their mortgage payments.
Exactly. In October 2024, the unemployment rate was just 4.1%. Now compare that to the peak of the 2008 crisis, when unemployment soared to 8.3%. A stable job market is a huge factor in preventing foreclosures.
Right. But the report also mentioned something called mortgage modification programs. What are those, and are they playing a role too?
Absolutely. Think of it like this. Imagine getting a helping hand when you need it most. That's what these modification programs do. They help homeowners who are struggling by adjusting their mortgage terms. Maybe it's lowering the interest rate, extending the loan term, or even allowing a temporary pause in payments. These programs have been crucial in preventing many homeowners from slipping into serious delinquency and ultimately facing foreclosure.
Interesting. So it's kind of a multi-layered safety net, responsible lending practices, high levels of home equity, low unemployment, and these mortgage modification programs acting as a buffer. But at the end of the day, what's actually happening with foreclosures on the ground? Are they increasing?
That's a great question. And it's where we start to dig into some real-world data. Let's take a look at foreclosure activity for October 2024 using data from ATTOM, a leading real estate data provider.
Okay, so according to ATM, there were 30,784 properties that filed for foreclosure in October. That's up 4% from September, but down 11% compared to October of last year. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, isn't it? What does this tell us?
Well, it shows us that foreclosure activity isn't static. It's constantly fluctuating. But the key takeaway is that overall, foreclosures remain relatively low compared to historical levels. And to really grasp the magnitude of the difference, the report provides a fascinating chart illustrating foreclosure activity from 2005 all the way through 2024. It visually captures the entire 2008 housing bust and its aftermath.
It's a stark reminder of just how bad things got back then. But what's even more striking is the contrast with our current situation.
Exactly. And there's one crucial difference that helps explain this contrast. Distressed sales.
Distressed sales, you mean when homeowners are forced to sell their homes at a loss
Right.
to avoid foreclosure?
Precisely. During the 2008 crash, we witnessed a massive wave of these distress sales. It was like a domino effect, with one foreclosure triggering another, driving prices down even further. But here's the key. Distress sales are currently at historically low levels.
So fewer homeowners are being forced to sell at a loss, which helps stabilize the market. That makes sense. But why are distressed sales so low right now? Is it because of all that equity we talked about earlier?
Exactly. Homeowners have more options now. They're not as desperate to sell at any price. And to illustrate just how much the market has shifted in favor of homeowners, consider this. The typical homeowner has gained an incredible $147,000 in housing wealth over the past 5 years.
Wow, that's incredible. I could see why people would be hesitant to sell in this market, but even with all these positive signs, I have to ask.
Ugh, I know what you're thinking.
Yeah.
Is there anything that could disrupt this relative stability? Are there any potential risks lurking on the horizon? Then those are great questions because it's important to acknowledge that no market is completely immune to risk. While a 2008-style foreclosure crisis seems unlikely, based on the current data, there are other potential factors that could influence the housing market's trajectory.
Okay, so we've solved the mystery of the missing foreclosure wave. But now we need to look for clues about what the next chapter in this housing saga might hold. You're saying there are other things that could shake things up. Besides the surge in foreclosures, what kind of risks are we talking about?
Well, for one, we can't ignore the potential impact of interest rates. What happens if they were to suddenly spike? That could put significant pressure on homeowners with adjustable rate mortgages or those who might be considering refinancing.
Right, and wouldn't rising interest rates also impact affordability for new buyers if it suddenly becomes more expensive to finance a home, even if prices stay the same? That's got to cool down demand.
Absolutely. And that cooling demand could lead to a slowdown in price growth or even a slight correction in some markets. It's a ripple effect. And speaking of ripple effects, we also need to consider the broader economic landscape. We've seen how closely tied delinquencies and foreclosures are to job security. What if we see a significant increase in unemployment?
That's a scary thought. People need jobs to make your mortgage payments, even with all that equity. If a large number of people lose their jobs, couldn't that trigger a wave of defaults?
It's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
Job losses could lead to an increase in delinquencies and ultimately put upward pressure on foreclosures. And then, of course, there are the unpredictable black swan events, those unexpected occurrences that can throw even the most carefully crafted forecasts off course.
Black swan events. Like what? Give me an example.
Think natural disasters, a global pandemic like the one we recently experienced, or some unforeseen geopolitical crisis. These are events that can have a profound impact on local, regional, or even national housing markets in ways that are very difficult to predict.
Okay, so even though the data suggests a 2008-style foreclosure crisis is highly unlikely in the near future, it's not a guarantee. There are other potential risks on the horizon that we need to keep in mind. It's like we need to stay vigilant. But how can everyday people, not just economists and analysts, really keep their finger on the pulse of the housing market? What should they be paying attention to?
That's a fantastic question, and it really highlights the importance of staying informed. For starters, keep a close eye on interest rate movements. Are they steadily rising? Are they fluctuating wildly? That can give you an indication of potential pressure points in the market.
So interest rates are one key indicator. What else?
Pay attention to any shifts in lending standards. Are lenders becoming more or less stringent in their requirements for borrowers? Changes in lending practices can signal either increasing caution or a loosening of the reins, both of which can impact the market.
Got it. Interest rates, lending standards. What else should we be watching?
And of course, keep an eye on the overall economy. Are there signs of an economic downturn? Are unemployment numbers rising? Those are key indicators that could potentially ripple through the housing market.
It sounds like there's a lot to keep track of, but honestly, this conversation has been incredibly helpful. It's given me a much clearer understanding of the forces at play in the housing market. I feel way less anxious now. knowing that a massive wave of foreclosures is unlikely. But you've also highlighted that we can't afford to be complacent. There are other risks and challenges out there.
Absolutely. Staying informed and understanding the underlying dynamics of the housing market empowers us all to make more informed decisions, whether we're homeowners, potential buyers, or simply interested observers.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to get your take on this. What stands out to you as the most important takeaway for our listeners? If you could boil it down to one key insight, what would it be?
For me, it's the power of homeowner equity. It's such a fundamental difference between the current market and the conditions that led to the 2008 crash. The fact that the average homeowner has such a substantial cushion of equity is a testament to the resilience of the housing market and the financial stability of many homeowners.
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in those alarming headlines about rising prices and potential bubbles. But it's so important to remember that the vast majority of homeowners are in a much stronger financial position than they were 15 years ago.
Exactly. And that stronger financial position has a ripple effect throughout the entire market, contributing to its overall stability.
So yes, there are risks to be mindful of, but the current housing market landscape, it's vastly different from the pre-2008 bubble era. We've got stricter lending standards, homeowners sitting on a mountain of equity, historically low distressed sales, and a relatively healthy job market.
It's a combination of factors that paints a much more optimistic picture than many people might assume.
I couldn't agree more. But before we completely wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder, a question that builds on what we've discussed today. We've talked about interest rates, economic downturns, and even those unpredictable black swan events. But what about other potential forces that could shape the future of housing? What about technological advancements or shifting social trends?
Those are great points to raise. Things like the rise of remote work, evolving demographics, and even climate change could all have unforeseen impacts on the housing market.
It's like we're looking ahead to the next chapter in this ongoing housing saga. And that leads us to our final thought for this deep dive. While we've seen that a massive foreclosure wave seems improbable, based on current data, it's important to remember that the future is always uncertain. New challenges and unexpected events can and will arise. So for our listeners, I want to leave you with this question to ponder, beyond the factors we've already discussed. What other potential economic forces, technological advancements, or even social trends could influence the future of the housing market in ways we might not be anticipating?
It's a big question and one that doesn't have easy answers. But that's what makes it so fascinating. The housing market is constantly evolving, shaped by a complex interplay of forces.
It's like we're playing a game of housing market chess, always thinking a few moves ahead.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of it. The housing market is dynamic, complex, and constantly influenced by a web of interconnected factors. Understanding those factors even just a little bit better empowers you to make more informed decisions, whether you're a homeowner, a potential buyer, or just someone who's curious about this crucial part of our economy.
So for all of our listeners out there, keep those questions coming. Keep diving deeper and never stop learning. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of housing and foreclosures. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive. And on that note, I want to thank Skip Benton with Coldwell Banker Select Real Estate for sponsoring today's deep dive. If you're in Northern Nevada and thinking about buying a home, give Skip a call. He can help you navigate these complex waters and find the right property for your needs.